First thing I want to start with is removing the wheel, and if you have the hubcaps that screw on with these little caps, go ahead and remove those with a 19mm socket. Okay, now you can remove the wheel, again with a 19mm socket. There we go. Now before I take anything apart, I want to push this caliper back just a little bit. That'll make it easier for me to remove it once it's unbolted. All right, just a little bit, not a lot. I just use a pry bar. Go into this slot here and just pry up against the rotor. Now take off these two 14mm bolts. These hold the caliper onto the bracket. That's one. Leave that in for now. Remove the second one. Take both of these off, and now you can take the caliper, set it aside. Okay, I'm just going to put it on top of the knuckle here, that way it's not putting any pressure on this brake hose. Now remove your brake pads. These are a little bit stuck in here, so I'm going to have to tap them out with the pry bar. Oh wow. There's one, and the second one. Now with a 15mm socket, let's remove these two bolts that hold the bracket onto the knuckle. Leave that one in a couple threads and remove this one. Now take them both off and remove your caliper bracket. Now let's remove the rotor. Sometimes it can be stuck on here, in which case you can hammer in between the studs. That usually breaks it free. Perfect. Now let's clean up and lubricate this bracket, prepare it for installation. The first thing I want to do is remove the anti-rattle clips that sit right here and on the other side. Now with a wire brush, I'm going to scrape off all of this rust that built up in here. If for you it's severe and it has a lot of pitted areas and raised areas, you want to sand it down. I'm just going to use this and gently sand down this surface. It's a little rustier than I'd like it to be. And I'll do the same to the other side. Now with it clean, take a little bit of grease, not a lot. You just want to coat it to prevent rust in the future. Add it to these areas right here. And if you put too much grease, then it'll squeeze out in the middle and get onto the rotor, so that's not good. So do both sides, and the reason you want to clean it up this well is because if there's too much rust buildup in here, it'll actually squish the pads on both ends, and basically it prevents them from releasing off of the rotor after you are done applying the brakes. So then you'll have braking issues. Now take the hardware supplied with your pads, and let's put it on here on both sides. Press it down all the way. The next thing I want to do is move on to the slider pins. I'm going to do them one at a time. So remove the old slider, pull the boot off. If these are very rusted for you, I would suggest cleaning out the inside of that hole with a bore brush. I still have plenty of fresh grease on here, so all I'm going to do is wipe it. Make sure that that ridge right there is clean. That's where the boot seals up. I'm going to add a little bit of grease in the boot. That's going to act as a reserve of grease because if you grease up the pin a lot, then most of it is just going to come off as you try to put it in the boot. So I'm just going to put a little bit on the pin, and I'll let the boot do the rest of the job. Make sure you get some grease up in that ridge there. That way the boot can seal up. Slide it in, press it all the way, and remove any air and excess grease by squishing the boot down. Now let's do the same to this side. As you can see, this side has a rubber piece on the end, and that's why I like to do them one at a time. That way I don't accidentally confuse the one with the rubber for the one with no rubber, because they're meant to go in a specific hole for a reason. All right, now this is ready for installation, so let's get it on the vehicle. Before the rotor goes on, I'm going to coat the hub with some anti-seize. I have a new hub here, but if I was reusing the old one, I would take a wire brush and just brush all the large chunks of rust off, scrape all the surface rust off, get it as clean as you can. That way the new rotor can mount flush up against the hub. At that point, give it a little spray with some anti-seize, or if you have the brush kind, that's good too. Usually it makes less of a mess. and try to avoid getting it on the lug studs. Now grab the new rotor, and I like to put it on backwards so I can clean the outer surface. Spray it with some brake parts cleaner. That's going to remove all the oils that are put on from the factory for shipping so it doesn't rust. Flip it over, and let's do the other side. Now you can install it fully. Now grab your caliper bracket, slide it over the rotor. Let's start in the 2 bolts. We'll start with this bottom bolt. Try to line this up and get it started. Now do the top one. Let's snug these up and then torque them to 85 foot-pounds. All right, let's get the pads in. With your pads, you'll see these little tabs. These are actually just the wear indicators that you need to put on to the pad. So I'm going to put it on the inner pad on the lower side, attach it with this bracket right here. The pad has a little cutout for it right where it needs to go. Okay, make sure it's pressed on all the way, and let's slide the pads in. Make sure they slide on easily. If they don't, that means you didn't clean up this bracket enough and they're getting squished, which is not good. You'll have braking issues. All right. Now before we put the caliper back on, I'm actually going to take an old pad, press it up against the caliper piston, and then take my caliper depression tool, put this in, and I'm going to press the piston of the caliper back in. Go very slow when you do this. Press it all the way so it can retract fully. That's it right there. Release it, and now we can install the caliper. One last thing I like to do before installing the caliper is putting a little bit of grease on this outer ring of the piston, as well as on these 2 ears here. That's going to help the pads operate quietly and smoothly. Let's get the caliper onto the bracket. Make sure it slides over the pads and goes over the slider pins. The slider pins actually line up with a cutout on the caliper, so make sure that they do line up. Get these 2 bolts in. Let's torque these 2 to 26 foot-pounds. Now do the same thing to the other side, and then let's install the wheel. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and then torque them to 100 foot-pounds. Don't forget about the hubcap. You want to line up the valve stem with the special cutout for it, but also line it up with all the lug nuts so you can thread on these caps for them. This is what's going to hold your hubcap on. So make sure these are on there, otherwise it's going to go flying. All right, off you go.